Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Geopolitical Cousins. Marco and I recorded this Monday, September 15th, around 9 p.m. Mountain Time. This is actually my second podcast of the day. I thought I'd been up for a while, but Marco told me after we recorded he'd been up since 2 a.m. doing work. So I think we did pretty well, although I could feel that we were both getting tired at the end. But we hope you enjoy the podcast. You can email me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com if you have any questions, comments, and concerns. We spend really the first hour of the podcast furthering the conversation that we started in our last episode about Charlie Kirk, about what that means about U.S. politics, about what that means about politics in general, both in the Western world and in the Western world and the rest of the world. How about that for a tongue twister? And then we turn our attention to things happening in Brazil, Russian drones in Poland and Romania, and other things. That's about it. Take care of each other. Cheers, and see you out there. All right, listeners. Marco looks beautiful because he was just on the phone with some clients. I look like it's 9 p.m. here in Park City, Utah. I was just regaling Marco with I'm speaking at a conference here at the St. Regis. And I don't have to iron my own clothes here because there's a butler service that comes and takes my clothes and presses it. I made the mistake of telling this to my wife on the phone when I called her to check in today. And she said, "I'm glad you're enjoying your luxurious vacation." And I was like, "Great, I'm a luxurious vacation." Anyway, I'm off the rails here. Marco, how's it going, man?
It's going good. I apologize for the jacket, but I was speaking to clients in Asia just now, just finished. And it's been a very long day, man. September has hit different this year, and not just because of the events. I just feel like everybody in the world has decided that that they took the summer off seriously and are now back with a vengeance. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, well, I mean, I spent most of August in bed with a fever with pneumonia, so I was oblivious to the rest of the world anyway. But I did notice that I came back from my pneumonia and nothing had really changed. And then like last week happened and I was like, what the fuck? Like, is this how it's going to be for the rest of the year? Because this is like, I can't even get on top of things until the next thing happens.
Well, and this is where maybe President Trump has a point, right? Maybe America's become a little bit too much like Europe, where everybody takes August off, you know? Could that be it? So making America great again is about never getting a vacation? I'm just kidding. I actually think everybody deserves a vacation. And I think people have genuinely, since COVID, just gotten more serious about taking the summer off. But with that comes the September rush. And I think we're both living through that. So speaking of the rush, I know you have a ton of stuff. You didn't tell me what. By the way, for those of you who don't know what we do, there's a reason there's Muppets on the cover of our podcast. We are Muppets. We don't coordinate ahead of time. We will tell each other if we have a gag, like, if we're putting world leaders in an order, we're going to tangentially talk about some rules of the game, but we do not pre-clear topics. So this is genuinely off the cuff. Jacob and I don't have time in our lives to actually plan this. So this is stream of consciousness. And so I have no idea. It
truly is.
Except for one topic I demanded we put on the schedule, which we'll get to later. Jacob, hit me. Let's go.
I'm going to hit you, and I want you to. Well, first of all, I want you to know somebody at Bespoke. I was on a call with them earlier this week, and they were like, "Jacob, you're putting so much energy into the podcast with cousin Marco. Like, how are you balancing things?" And I was like, "I'm glad it seems that way because literally the energy that I put into it is the hour and a half that I'm recording with him. Like, it's 90 minutes. Like, that's the 90 minutes of energy."
Nobody believes this, but this is who we are. Like, we don't have to practice to do this. This is who we are. So that's why we're
we also worked like dogs for 15 years to develop the expertise. I mean, this is the classic, it's the Malcolm Gladwell expertise thing, right? 10,000 hours and then you're an expert at it. Like, the reason you work so hard in your 20s and 30s is so that when you get to where you are right now, like, you can do things quicker than everybody else. Like, that's the
interesting.
Game. That's how
I would say that my expertise of this podcast is just comedic relief. But yes, I have worked on that for 43 years by being a clown. So let's.
Well, let's do it. All right, Marco, I'm a habitual tabs abuser, as people who know me well, but I have 27 tabs open right now with different things to weave into the podcast, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to weave them all. First, I'm going to start you with a really great trivia question. I don't know if this is the biggest cumulative financial return you could have had from an investment since 2004, but I want to ask you, I want to give you a return, and I want you to try and guess what it is. Let's say that there is an asset that you could have monthly cumulative return since 2004 of 3,821%. What asset do you think I am talking about?
Oof.
I know it's tough, right? I'll give you some clues here. The S&P 500 over this time period jumped 483%. Meta, the artist formerly known as Facebook, that's 1,844%. So we're talking like double, triple. I can't do math. What Meta did over the same time period. You're not going to guess it, but do you want to take a stab?
Turkish equities. I don't know. Hit me.
Pokemon cards. Fuck you, Secrets of Pokemon. This was written up in the Wall Street Journal, and I saw this, and I couldn't believe it, and I just wanted to let you know. You could have had a completely unregulated, Pokemon cards are not subject to financial regulation. The story was about this guy who bought his fiance like a 3.5 carat diamond ring with a gold band because he'd bought some Pokemon cards back in his youth. So buy Pokemon cards. That's where I'm beginning the podcast. That's the level at which we're pitching right now.
Well, I have nothing to say about that.
I also could have begun the podcast with the news that 2 students at Cornell University killed a 120-pound black bear and brought the carcass back to the dorm where they skinned and butchered the remains. Not only that, they did it all with a valid New York State hunting license and killed the bear lawfully. So they did nothing wrong. Cornell, of course, is my alma mater. This is the coolest thing that I've ever read happening at Cornell University. We could talk about the potential biosignature from the Perseverance Mars rover. If you're wondering what a biosignature is a substance that might have biological origin, but requires more data before a conclusion can be reached. So really it's nothing, but we have the chance that maybe there was life on Mars before they actually realized it. We have one, this one is really good, Marco. I really want to get your take on this. Did you see Elon Musk and his video at the British rally?
No,
did you see
I did not. Sure.
Okay. Well, he participated in this rally via video, and he spoke for about 5 minutes, and he said some crazy stuff. I mean, he's Elon Musk. He says crazy things. One of the things he said was, if this continues, violence is going to come to you. You will have no choice. You're in a fundamental situation here. Whether you choose violence or not, you either fight back or you die. That's the truth, I think. I don't care about him saying those things, though. The thing that I really want to talk about is for the 5 minutes that he was speaking, he was wearing a t-shirt that said, "What would Orwell think?" And he even referenced George Orwell as he went off on his rant. And Marco, I almost lost my mind because I know Elon Musk is smart. He can do Tesla and he's going to Mars and he's doing all these other things. But has he read George Orwell? Like, George Orwell fought with the communists in Spain. He was a democratic socialist for all of his life. He was a member of the Labor Party. You really think that you're on the same team as George Orwell? It really pissed me off. I don't know if you want to weigh in there.
We're only down 4 tabs out of 27. First of all, I want to say that the butler service at St. Regis is clearly awesome because whatever drink came with the steaming of your suit was excellent. I love this. Well, that we just lost pretty much everybody. You're drinking the bougiest sparkling water in the world. That's nice. I mean, look, I think it was that kind of week. We've had a lot of really interesting stuff going on, and we're just being the information space is like bombarding us with stuff.
It is. And any one of those, like, we need to talk about all those things. Like, life on Mars is really important. Like, Elon Musk suddenly pivoting to, I'm of British ancestry, I want to talk to Britain. Like, those are all things that are interesting. We also need to get to Trump bombing another Venezuelan ship. When he was asked if he had proof, he said, quote, "All you have to do is look at the cargo that was splattered all over the ocean. Big bags of cocaine and fentanyl." I can't even read it without keeping a straight face.
Flour.
The big UK... Yeah, or flour, whatever else. The big UK-US deal. I mean, I'm just going through things right now. I have a rant about childhood vaccination. I want to ask you about your boy, Stephen Mirren, joining the Fed board. But to bring things down, because I know we've been silly. Why don't we get a little less silly and begin right where we began last time, Marco, which is Charlie Kirk's assassination. Since last we spoke, you and I spent the last 20 minutes on our last podcast talking about the Charlie Kirk assassination and what it meant. We have some more information now. We don't have a ton of information, but we know that it was a young man. His name is Tyler Robinson. It seems that he's 22 years old, like a native of Utah. He comes from a conservative family, both of his parents registered Republicans. It seems that there's a lot of unclear things here. Like there's the news about the bullets were engraved with memes like "catch this fascist" or something like that. He is in a relationship or was living with a transgender person, a man transitioning to be a woman, and that person has been cooperating with authorities, was aghast at what he did. His own family sort of had to turn him in. We talked about Charlie Kirk and Charlie Kirk being killed for his political opinions. But I think one of the things we really need to talk about, and I put this out on X, is a podcast, one of our very first podcasts, where you came with something that you really wanted to talk about, which was the crisis of manliness. You might remember, it was the Russian Orthodox guy who was, I forget exactly what the story was around the Orthodox guy. You can probably re-educate us. But I think as both sides try and blame each other, and as the Trump administration talks about going after leftist woke groups, and if the leftist groups are secretly hoping that Tyler Robinson was really a closet Republican so that they can say that really this was all the right, and everybody trying to blame each other. I think the real crisis here is that we have a pandemic of young men shooting people and engaging in violent acts, whether it's at schools, whether it's an attempted assassination against Donald Trump, whether it's the assassination of Charlie Kirk. What's going on with young men, and what do you think this says about our country? And do you still hold, Marco, with the idea that Charlie Kirk was killed for his political views, or is it really actually Charlie Kirk was killed by a lost soul, and that we have a lot of these lost souls? If you look at the post-COVID generation, the way education is going, where people are deriving meaning, trust in institutions, blah, blah, blah. That's, I think, where we should start seriously.
Okay. Yeah. So a couple of months ago, like 4 or 5 months ago, I read an article about a Russian Orthodox priest operating in the United States of America who was offering, young men in the U.S. A way to feel like awesome manliness. I forgot what the phrase was, but uber manliness. I think it was uber
manliness. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the whole thing just like was nonsense. But it's one of the fastest growing, apparently, like religions. And it got me thinking because there was a great book that I really recommend everybody reads by Richard Reeves, who the title is Off Boys and Men. And it talks about basically how profound economic and social changes of the recent decades have seen a lot of boys and young men basically lose ground in the classroom and eventually the workplace. Now, the story that's well known and a lot of people have riffed on is that it's because you can't really get paid for muscle the way you did in the past. Like putting things together is not what the economy needs. Whereas, so in other words, less educated men are struggling, whereas less educated women can still have the same jobs they did 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. People still need, somebody to serve you a cup of coffee, somebody to work in the service industry. And, so less educated women are not being heard, less educated men are. And so then there's this revolt of men, and they vote for Trump, and we want their jobs back, and we want to, build things with hammers. But actually, the book of Boys and Men, obviously a play on of Mice and Men. Richard Reeves doesn't talk about that. He basically just says, look, boys develop slower, like period. And anybody who has boys and girls, as I do, knows exactly what I'm talking about. Like when my son was like 2 years old, I thought there was something like mentally wrong with him. And then my wife and my mom and my aunt and my grandmas were all like, no, sweetheart, he's just a boy, and it was like, oh, whoa, like, okay. And so what Richard Reeves argues is that by defeating gender stereotypes, by doing incredible work over the last 50 years in creating equality between men and women, We've just, like basically countered the kind of things that slowed girls down, and now they're crushing boys because, well, they are intellectually more developed at that age than boys are. And, it's a very difficult and unpalatable argument for most people to find out, because it means that our entire society is structured to defeat this inequality that's inherent in millennia of male dominated society. But we've crushed that inequality in the last 50 years. And yes, there's still more to do at the very top, like more CEOs are men than women, sure. But a vast majority of college students in legal, in medical, and other professional fields, other than some STEM fields, are now women. So they are being more successful than men because of this basically biological issue. And so how do you fix that? And when Richard Reeves wrote this book, there was this very interesting, how did I find out about him? Quite frankly, the YouTube algorithm sent me to his interview with The Daily Show, a very liberal, you know, um, obviously comedy show. And I certainly enjoy it, and it's funny and so on. And then there's this, um, interesting moment, and we can put it in the show notes, where he's being interviewed. Um, and the woman interviewing him, Desi Liddick, who's a great comedian, at first starts making fun of him. Like, wait a minute, this is nonsense. Like, are you trying to say that we should help men and boys? And she like literally makes fun of that. And he's like, yeah, I know, we kind of should. And so that's what our episode was a couple of months ago. We mentioned this. But then when you raised this again to me on a text, something came into my head from high school. Um, and it was Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, which was published in 1866. And if you haven't read this book, you probably shouldn't. It's like, it's very dense. Russian literature is,
I tried to read Crime and Punishment once to impress a girl who was like doing her master's thesis on it, and the relationship lasted long enough for me to get 200 pages in, which I thought was pretty good. It was a good
that
faith
is
college
long,
project.
my friend Jacob. What a summer. Each one of those pages was a week. Unless you were, speed reading, which would make sense too. I don't know. But look, in the novel, Crime and Punishment, the main character Raskolnikov is a young student who has a superiority complex and thinks he is, the hot shit. But life is hard because it's 1866 and it's Tsarist Russia, and elites have overproduced. There's too many of them, and there's very few ways for a young man, no matter how educated, and Raskolnikov is most certainly overeducated. That is almost his problem. He becomes mad with this injustice that he feels has befallen him, and therefore he brutally murders his landlady, his landlord. And then the book is about the guilt that basically tears him apart. And the reason that I thought of this is because you texted me, after we did our podcast, and you were like, look, this isn't about what Charlie Kirk believed in. This isn't about this, that, or the other. This is about young men. It's the episode we recorded. And I said, yes, but what's interesting about that realization is that young men are committing all these violent acts. I think this Tyler, uh, you know, assassin, I'm shocked by how many people that I love, I respect on both the left and the right, are so obsessed about whether he was left and right. And I both think it's so shocking, because so many of my good friends on both left and right are now firmly convinced he was one or the other. Firmly, because they're just feeding the same social media propaganda. And if you're left, he is, a false flag operation, which, I just want to remind my liberal and left-leaning friends, was kind of what Alex Jones was saying about some of those shooting. And if you're on the right, he's obviously a member of the Antifa. And the reality is that I don't think he's crazy. And I don't want us to use that as an excuse either. But I think there's an anarchic component to this kind of sentiments that a lot of young people in the country have. And it's that they have been basically sold a future, go to college, get a job, you'll be a member of the middle class. That's gone. Um, and it's creating this real disdain for society. So is Tyler Robinson, is he left? Is he right? I think he was whatever allowed him to have an anarchic default setting. I think this is anarchism coming back. And anarchism was a big problem in the late 19th century. You can read a lot of Russian literature about it in Russia, but even beyond. These weren't socialists. They weren't
in the United
fascists.
States. I was just on a call earlier today where they were talking about the anarchists trying to blow up the blowing up Wall Street in the early 1920s. Like it's not so far from home.
It's not so far from, and that's what I think we're dealing with. And I think that that's where I would settle on. I think that this is not about left or right. It's about a whole generation of obviously men, of young men who don't have much of a future, and they're angry, and they're going to find whatever avenue they can. And the thing about that is that in 1866, when Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment, there was no social media. So just blaming social media is not enough. I think it's almost a crutch that many in America use because it doesn't force them to change anything in their lives. How many of us are guilty for social media? Well, a very small number of us. Most of them are in Silicon Valley. Most of them are trillionaires, and we can just all blame them and then feel collectively like it's not our fault that there's this whole generation of men that we don't know what to do with. But hey, it's Mark Zuckerberg's fault that they're shooting up politicians and public figures like Charlie Kirk. I don't have a solution for this. All I'm saying to our listeners is go get some clip notes, read Crime and Punishment, and just realize that we have gone through these cycles before, these cycles of political unrest that don't end in civil war, that don't necessarily end in World War III, but it could last decades, where there's just a whole generation where that's angst-filled.
Yeah, I love the invocation of Raskolnikov as the original incel. That's really great. But there's a couple other things I want to add to what you're saying, because I do think I'm with you. I want to blame Mark Zuckerberg for everything, because who wouldn't want to blame Mark Zuckerberg for everything? But I do think there's a social media aspect to it. And I think social media exacerbates something that began in the late 1800s. I think as you change people's relationship to information, and as you move steadily from the printing press all the way to newspapers, to radio, to TV, to social media, the throughput there is that you're getting information more and more instantaneously. And those things can shape your views more and more. And this isn't just about men. Like, you're absolutely right about Richard Reeves, but the book I would pair it with, I only have 2 daughters. So the book I read recently was Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation. And The Anxious Generation is about how we've moved from a play-based childhood to social media or screen-based childhood. And he goes through some really, really disturbing data that shows, you can sort of pinpoint it to the year when social media, when smartphones and screens were starting to be put in children's faces. And women or young girls, their rates of suicide have skyrocketed, because when they interact with these things, they see these platonic ideals that aren't reality, but they think that they want to live up to. And so instead of exerting violence on the people around them, their violence consumes them from the inside. Like, that is the female personality type, and they start hating themselves. And the statistics are mind-boggling about how those suicide rates have increased. They've increased for boys too, but not nearly at the rate for girls. And I think that boys, when they get into this sort of situation, if you are a boy, if you have these tendencies, that this is something you have to learn how to get under control when you're a teenager, because you want to lash out, you want to be violent. There are reasons that boys fight each other all the time, and are more aggressive with each other because they're trying to figure these things out. And so when boys get lost like this, the anger comes out and it attacks other things. And there are different pathologies for how women and how men are going to express these things. But there is something at the root core of this, which is social media is getting into the prefrontal cortex of these young people before their brains are fully formed, and affecting the ways that they think about themselves and their self-worth. You and I are immune to this, because I remember when smartphones appeared. I was already a mostly formed human being. I also remember when I was doing MS-DOS and I had big, black floppy disks, and when I couldn't call someone on a cell phone. Like, I came of age in a time where I was still outside, like banging my trash can lid and tilting literally at windmills because I had to get all the violent behavior out of my system. And then I had to go trash talk on the basketball court. So I think there is something there to that. And there's an increase in radicalization, and it pairs along with some of the things that are happening in society. I think there's also a second order thing that you're talking about, and I'm with you, the way that both the right and left want to blame each other here. And I think the second order impact is that there's no longer a shared collective narrative. Certainly in the United States around this, I think you could argue in the Western world in general, the left is going to believe what it believes and the right is going to believe what it believes. And it doesn't matter who Tyler Robinson is, because he's already been created as the Antifa guy on the right, and he's already been created by the closet conservative who is reacting against his conservative household and had too many guns by the left. And both of those sides are going to go to their dinner parties and say, can you believe it? Like, can you believe that this whole time, like, we were right? None of them are going to be talking to each other because they're blaming each other. And then the last thing I'll just say before I turn it back over to you is there is so much about Tyler Robinson that we still don't know. Like, the trans roommate that Tyler was living with has been cooperating with authorities. His parents, I mean, can you imagine having to call the authorities on your own kid? Like, I can't even process that, but they've been cooperating with authorities. His friends have been cooperating with authorities. He hasn't told authorities shit. We're recording on September 15th, September 15th at 9:32 p.m. Central Time. I just read an article 30 minutes ago that the police say, and the FBI say, he hasn't told us anything. He's not telling us anything about his motive. He's not telling us anything about how he feels. He's not cooperating one bit. So people are interpreting and extrapolating from his life and what we know about the situation, but we actually have not heard from the kid. For all we know, I mean, he's 22. I Googled this today, and that means I'm a medical professional. I'm not staying at a Holiday Inn. I'm staying at a St. Regis with butler services, but schizophrenia manifests between the ages of 16 and 31. What's to say that he's not manifesting the first episodes of schizophrenia? Like, a lot of these lone wolf crazy assassin types, when you go back in the assassination of political figures in the United States, come from schizophrenic episodes where they're papering the walls with tin foil and they're going after the people that they think are, reading their brainwaves and whatever else. So for all we know, that could be the path that he's going down to. It has nothing to do with our highfalutin points about boys and girls and social media and everything else. So I would just really caution people from taking the jump that we know anything about Tyler Robinson. I think the more concerning thing is it doesn't matter. Like, the genie's out of the bottle, and this narrative is going to be on the right and left. Like, it's not going to be a thing that brings us together. That's already very clear to me. And that, I think, is a really depressing statement on the state of politics and culture in our society. And I don't know how to change it.
Yeah, and I think that so there's a lot of different, thinkers out there that maybe our listeners want to check out. One is somebody that you and I both don't have a lot of maybe time for. Neil Howe has been talking about how there's these generational waves, and therefore there's this fourth turning when the good times end and there's a crisis and there's a revolt. But he never really describes what this looks like. And I think a lot of people who read Neil Howe, they somehow think that there is a demographic tipping point where you have to have a calamity, a war, or civil war. And what I would say is that that period in late industrialization is very similar to the periods today. And it lasted for decades, like 40 years, 1880s to 1920s. There was a lot. There was a lot of depressions, there was a lot of recessions, and there was a lot of violence, political violence. And part of the reason is that states had to industrialize education in order to have an industrialized labor force. And so they took a lot of kids and taught them a lot of stuff. Now, you might laugh at that and say, well, that's nowhere near the power of information in your iPhone. But when you take somebody from a farm and you teach them some simple things, it's perhaps even more than giving an already educated urbanite an iPhone. For example, I did not grow up with an iPhone. I'm too old, but I had Encyclopedia Britannica on a CD-ROM, and it had a lot of information. And so the point is that when you educate people, you will end up over-educating some of them. They will be overeducated for their state in life. And that's when the angst sets in. And that's why there was so much anarchism and so much angst in those 1880s, 1920s. There was other reasons, but technological change, informational change. Um, and I think that we're facing a similar situation today. Neil Howe, he presents an argument in his Ford Turning argument that, somehow this comes to a boiling point. And I'm not sure it does. It can be a slow burn. And so the commentary right now has been extremely negative. It's just been, focused on the fact that something is coming. I'm not sure that it is. I think we could just be in a state of heightened political unrest for a long time as we're trying to deal and adjust to this new information overload. The other thinker writer that I would recommend people kind of peruse is Peter Turchin. Peter Turchin talks about effectively how overproduction of elites causes a systemic collapse. Again, very kind of, we reach a trigger point. Peter Turchin is a very interesting guy. He looks at, he basically modeled this on ecosystems in nature. When you have too many deer that overpopulate, they end up eating all the nutrients and then the population collapses. So there's all these population collapses in biology and in ecology. And in a way, so can advanced human societies. They reach a point where there's too many elites competing for scarce resources. They're all trying to get their kid to an Ivy League school like Cornell so they can sit on boards of various companies making six-figure salaries.
No, so that they can go skin a bear and bring it back to the dorm room and butcher it without breaking a law. That's why we're doing it at Cornell. Don't forget it.
Yeah, so I think that's another way to think about it. And again, I'm offering our listeners a lot of readers who are going to scare you. If you want to be scared, pick up a copy of Neil Howe's work or Peter Turchin. I, on the other hand, I look at the 1880s to 1920s, 1930s. A lot of bad stuff happened during this time. Of course, there were 2 world wars. There's a lot of terrorism at the time. There's a lot of great books written about this time. Obviously, lots of Russian literature, but you can also read something like Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes, which is about this period of time as well. And what I would say about it is that, it doesn't mean that we're necessarily coming to a head. We're not necessarily coming to a climax. It might just be a period of time during which a lot of young men born into this sort of world where girls and their problems have been overemphasized for a very long time for good reason, because of gender inequality. I get that. But no one's kind of looked at their problems. And then on top of that, you have this information overload. And on top of that, you have a post-industrial society where, AI is disrupting particularly that part of the labor pool where you, a 22-year-old, is supposed to get a job. We might just be in that world for 10 years without a civil war, without a complete collapse of society, but it will just have heightened level of this kind of violence. And unfortunately, Charlie Kirk paid that price, the ultimate price. And, I hope that nobody else does, but you can both be pessimistic and say there will be, unfortunately, many other victims like Charlie Kirk, and at the same time say, but it doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to have a civil war.
Yeah, and I also think there's an element of this to where, like, things are, and this is one question I want to put to you because I don't know how to answer this question. I want to ask you whether this is particularly American or whether this is global and whether it's manifesting in global ways. But I also just want to point out that in most of the episodes that you're talking about, we're talking about incredible and major economic disruption, and we are not there yet right now. Like, the U.S. economy is doing, or maybe it's not doing great today with some of the monthly statistics, but you look at where the U.S. economy is, you wouldn't look at the U.S. economy and say this is an economy in crisis. Unemployment, even if it's been up a little bit lately and the BLS has some bad jobs report, like, you're talking about unemployment of 5%. You're talking about, the Fed is being bullied into cutting rates when prices are running hot. Like, if you didn't have the tariffs and the trade war and the volatility, we'd still probably be going from strength to strength. Like, some of these moments that you're talking about in history, like the 1880s, like, at least in the United States context, that's to your point, rural to urban, rebuilding from the Civil War, the robber barons and Carnegie and Rockefeller and like all of these things, tremendous wealth inequality in society, and the poorest have nothing, and the rich are so rich that they feel bad about it, so they start giving charity and having temperance movements and everything else because the other people are so poor and so disgusting. Like we're nowhere close to that in the U.S. economy.
That's concerning, right? And what I would say to you is, first of all, 1873 to 1879 was the Long Depression, followed by 1882 to 1885, which was a depression. And then later, 1929, of course, 1941, which is the Great Depression. But before the Great Depression, there were two very, very painful periods. And that, of course, was a period of turbulence. It gave us McKinley against Bryan, right? The famous election that was really interesting, that almost ushered in socialism in the United States of America. At the time, instead, he gave us kind of nationalist populism of McKinley, which is very interesting, to Sanders versus Trump. And you're right. At the time, the U.S. federal government was very small as percent of GDP. So it couldn't offset these very painful periods of time. It couldn't preempt them. And so we just got pain. Today, the U.S. government or government of any other country is not very small. And so they have preempted this pain. And I would argue that in 2020, the original sin of the last 5 years that we're going to have to pay back in some way, shape, or form was that fiscal stimulus of 2020, 2021, which I think had very little to do in the U.S. with COVID and the pandemic. I think it had everything to do with policymakers in this country of both parties effectively trying to shower the households with cash so as to assuage the negative implications of income inequality. But that is something that's going to stay with us. And I think we're going to still see the pendulum swing left and right over the next couple of years. But that is the kind of world we're in. International context, what's interesting about that is that I think the United States and the United Kingdom are not really inoculated from some of this extremism. And I know a lot of listeners are not going to like this, and this is not a high conviction view, but just hear me out. Greece had unemployment rates of 20, 30%, youth unemployment rates in 40s, 50s. The 2010s were a very difficult time in Europe, where youth unemployment was between 40 and 60% in most Spain, Italy, Greece. Greece had to adjust its fiscal deficit by some 15% of GDP. I mean, just insane number. And I think during all the protests in Greece, something like 5 to 6 people died. Over the course of 10 years that Greece had to struggle with this, I think you can measure the deaths during this period of time on your two hands. And most of them actually, like 4 or 5 of them died in this one tragedy where a bank was set on fire in Athens, a bank with some people in it, by the protesters. So in fact, half of all the deaths during all the protesting in Greece, during a decade of incredible economic malaise, were caused in this one incident. What am I getting at? Well, I'm getting at the fact that if the United States of America adjusted its fiscal deficit by 15%, I think it would be much worse in this country. If we had youth unemployment rates of 80%, given how this Tyler gentleman felt about his state in life, I think we would have a lot more tragedies like Charlie Kirk. And yet in Greece, somehow we didn't have that. Is it because Greeks are particularly nonviolent people? Is it that the sunshine, the feta, the olives, and a great white wine is the recipe to laissez-faire and blasé attitude towards life? I don't think so. I think
Is it because the young men that you're talking about didn't experience social media and smartphones? They grew up eating olives on the Parthenon?
But we can't say that because, of course, we've had revolutions, anarchy, we've had terrorism throughout history. So what is it? And I think the only way that I can really pinpoint it is that Europe has been inoculated, which is a great segue perhaps to another topic that you want to discuss, which is vaccinations.
Oh, God. I'll just have a rant. I mean, we can discuss it if you want. I'm going to get so much hate for it.
But listen, I think Europe descended into fascism. It descended into left-wing anarchism and left-wing extremism. There were running battles across Europe between fascists and communists throughout the 30s. That's what the brown shirts were really about, just by brawling in the streets. Europe, not America, not Canada, not the United Kingdom, continental Europe ended up setting up an industrialized system to kill 6 million Jews. Europe did. And so after that, Europe has acquired a certain immunity to, I think, wanton extremist political violence. Now, that's not necessarily the case. In the 70s and 80s, you had Baader-Meinhof, the Red Brigades. You had the days of the lead in Italy. You had ETA, you had IRA. But at the same time, it was, I don't know. It just was never a viable political, certainly, option. And I think, and even in France, for example, right now, where you have very powerful populist Marine Le Pen, one of the things she had to do to become a viable politician is effectively disown her father. Not literally disown him, but like she doesn't bring up dad, because dad is like an actual anti-Semite. So there's a certain level of decorum in Europe that I think is a product of this inoculation from the fact that they became fascists. They became Nazis and they became Marxists and communists. On the other side of the ocean is the United States of America that won World War II, that along with Soviet Union saved humanity from the horrors of Europe. It's America that saved us, again, along with Soviet Union. Let's not forget their sacrifice. But the fact is that America has always seen itself as a victor, as a shining sort of light on the hill or whatever, city on the hill. It was always right. It did not descend into fascism. It didn't even descend into moderate socialism. And so because of that, I think on some very interesting level, probably level that starts when you're 6 years old and you go to first grade in France, and in second, third, fourth grade, they send you to the trenches on a field trip and tell you, well, right here, 60,000 men died in one charge. Like, how interesting is that? Because of that history of like, oh my God, there's a madness. We have a gene of madness and we need to guard against it very carefully. That is taught to every European. There's a genetic madness in us. We have killed on an industrial scale millions of humans because they're different. We did that. Not in the 19th century with slavery. No. Like your dad participated in this. Because of that, I think that to answer your question, do I think this is the same in every country? I don't. And if there's one, as an outside observer in many ways of the US, I both studied comparative politics, which is a weird part of political science, where very few people do. You basically treat every country as a petri dish. You don't believe in any exceptionalism whatsoever. It's complete nonsense. Every country can be broken down to its sinews, both as a student of that and as somebody who's lived all over the place, because my own country fell apart when I was a kid. I look at the US, and if I was to say what's the difference between US and Europe, and the reason I think it is different in the US is this country is just not inoculated against that extremism. In other words, I think a European knows when they're saying something that's kind of fascist or kind of communist or kind of Marxist or Trotskyite. They kind of know inherently. They've got that vaccine jabbed into them when they're 6, like, yo, no, that's not really kosher. I don't think in the US kids have that. And then they grow up in adults and they don't know that the things they're saying are kind of off. And that's because, in a very endearing and positive thing, this is great about America. It was not evil to that extent in the last 150 years. It just wasn't. It never had a moment of madness where it cooked people in freaking ovens. And America should be proud of that. On the other hand, is it prepared for this world of social media and extremism? Like, are we inoculated enough?
Well, yeah, and I'll make a joke here that's going to cut deep. People really have to follow along. If the Mossad hadn't assassinated Huey Long, maybe America would have descended into fascism. Now that joke cuts because Mossad didn't exist when Huey Long was assassinated. I'm poking fun at the conspiracy theorists, but I want to go back at you, Marco, and say, because you talked about Europe, and I mean, there's some point to that. I was actually last night, because this is what nerds do, I was like reading about the Battle of Stalingrad. Do you know how many
Of
people
course.
died at the Battle of Stalingrad?
Like 600,000 or something?
3 million. 3 million
bad.
people
I'm sorry.
total.
Yeah.
It was like 1.5 million combatants, and then when you put all the deaths of
You gotta
everything
give
all
me
together,
over-under. Come on,
I
Jacob.
know. I'm sorry.
I mean,
It was not
give me
fair. It
over-unders
was not
here.
fair.
Yeah.
It was not fair. It was a lot more than Pokemon cards have increased
Wow,
in
yes.
price since 2004. But like, I mean, I couldn't even like swallow that. I was like, 1.5 million soldiers died in a conflict over. Like, I mean, like, think about Donetsk and Luhansk, and it's like, is that anything? But I want to go back to you and say, because you talked about, specifically Nazi Germany, but also everything that happened in Europe. Asia's the part that makes me like, I want to think about Asia a little bit, because first of all, Japan was awful. What Japan
Awful.
did to China
Yep.
and what they did on the Korean Peninsula and all these other places, I mean, it wasn't quite as mechanized and ordered, but you're talking about, levels of brutality that were that big, and human beings have a potential for brutality. But I'm wondering, if you look at Asia, like, are young Chinese men feeling this as they get replaced from their manufacturing job by robots? When we're looking at Nepal, which just last week, they were stripping ministers in the street and beating them. They burned the former prime minister's wife alive in her house. And then they elected some new leader on Discord. Indonesia, like, protests all over the country. India and the embrace of Hindu nationalism, which also has to mean a rejection of a more cosmopolitan past where Hindus and Muslims are living together in peace and harmony, because it has to be Hindu nationalists first, and then what that means for Pakistan and what that means for Bangladesh around them. Like, are those seeds there? Like, how do we think about,
Yeah,
because
I
I
think
think the
you're right.
future, like Europe and the United States is the past. Like, Asia is the future, and they're also boiling. And as we talk about Charlie Kirk, and it's horrific. One more thing about Charlie Kirk, I'm going to say something that maybe will piss people off, and I'm going to make a metaphor to Ray Rice. You think Ray Rice would have been suspended and had his career ended if somebody hadn't caught on video him punching his girlfriend? Like, if it had just been a media report that Ray Rice was in a domestic violence incident, he probably would have been suspended for 2 games, and that would have been it. But if you remember this Baltimore Ravens running back, there's video of him, like, punching his girlfriend out cold, like, just like
Yeah,
vicious.
I
And
remember
everybody
seeing it.
was like, absolutely not. I feel a little bit the same way with Charlie Kirk, and this goes back to social media, because I didn't even really know who Charlie Kirk was, but I was at an event in Fargo, and I opened Twitter, and I saw the video, and I was like, oh my God, like, that happened? And like, it created this, I felt the same way about October 7th, by the way. Like, the thing that was so, I mean, there were lots of things that were depressing about October 7th, but there were videos of Hamas going in and assaulting people and killing children, and parents standing in front of, Hamas people to try and save their children. It was like this visceral, emotional thing. So that's kind of an aside. But then there's also, like, I think something is also happening in Asia. It's just expressing itself in a completely different way. And I don't think in the West we should get so over-indexed on our other thing and see that there is something else going on here generally.
No, I agree. I mean, look, I think history is really important. And I think how history is taught is really important. And I think that the knowledge of the capacity to do great evil is powerful. And I don't think that the US has that. I think that some of the, focus on, for example, the history of the United States of America, slavery, things like that. It's always interesting to me that the more right of center conservatives really scoff at that. I think they shouldn't. I think it's a really good education. The problem is that slavery is so far removed from modern day that it's difficult for anyone to sort of think that they as humans have a deep capacity for evil, and therefore they should guard against that. And as Abraham Lincoln, seek the counsel of the better angels. I forgot how the phrase goes, but
Better angels of our nature. Yeah.
right. And so I think that it's very difficult, I think, because the U.S. history over the last 100 years is pretty much a history where the U.S. has been on the side of the morality, it's very difficult to then, perceive that you have capacity as just human beings for evil. And similarly, this is the story you're making of places around the world that have never really been humbled by being on the wrong side of history, and I fear those countries more than I fear countries that have done great evil and know they have. Um, so that's kind of how I would put it. And I
Yeah.
and
I
that's something that I really worry about. I worry about, like, how will we know as a society when we have reached a point, like, and this is, and like, a lot of people just don't know enough about German history. But look, if you were a PhD student in philosophy in 1930 at Cornell, aside from skinning bears, you know what you were also doing? You were learning German.
Yeah.
You could not get a PhD in philosophy in the early 20th century without being fluent in German, because that was the only language that mattered aside from ancient Greek or ancient, or like Latin.
But,
You,
by the
right?
way, I would throw in my father, who got a PhD in government at Cornell in the late 1960s, had to be fluent in German in order to get it. So it lasted longer than even you think.
So yeah, so like, this is what's interesting. This is a country that gave us incredible philosophy, the cabaret culture of Berlin. Like, look it up. It was very provocative for the time. Like, this was one of the most liberal countries in the world that was not just an industrialized powerhouse. It was also full of literature. It was full of philosophy. And then it descended into madness. And the Germans know they did it. And so, to me, the question is, what countries don't know that they have a capacity for that? Because I'm in a way a pessimist, because I think every country has a capacity for deep, deep evil. There is absolutely nothing about American history or American Constitution that prevents that. Um, and so, when something like, political violence starts up, my question is, how alarmed is the public? And I think that it depends on the history of that country, and on how, how deep are the scars, or how effective was the vaccination and the inoculation of the history.
Yeah, I want to both agree with you and disagree with you. And I want to disagree with you by giving you like a couple of anecdotes. The first is, I grew up in rural Georgia in a town that is still segregated. There's a black part of town and there's a white part of town. And there is a Confederate memorial in the center of the town to honor the purity of the white women and men who died for the sake of the cause. And it's really jarring to go there on a Saturday night where there's country music playing and everybody's mixing both races together. And in the middle of this town square is this massive Confederate memorial, like memorializing that. So in some sense, like, those things are very present in some of these areas. I also grew up in a town where the Klan was still around. Like, I was a Jew living in a southern town, and like, we knew that we didn't wear, like, I went to school in the city. I knew that when I got home, I was not supposed to wear a kippah on my head. I was not supposed to wear a kippah in my hometown because they were around. And you sort of knew the streets that they lived on and where I wasn't allowed to go. So like, I had a sense that like there was like evil lurking in some of these places. To that extent also, like, there's slavery. There's also, go to any poor Indian reservation in the United States today and look at the education system, look at the healthcare system, look at the rates of everything from obesity to cardiovascular disease to educational like accomplishment. Like, you will see some of the original sins of the American Republic. And yes, it like was hundreds of years ago, but like, it's still there. On the flip side, this is probably somebody I've referenced before, but I just thought it was so prescient. Tony Judt, who was taken from us way too early because of ALS, gave this incredible lecture, I think it was in 2007, 2008, where he was talking about the crisis of universities, well before it was popular to talk about the crisis of universities. And his parting shot was, the end of democracy in America, or the end of education in America, will not be because of the will to power of a malicious actor, but because of the will to ignorance of the people. And in that vein, we had what's the source here? I forget. It's the National Report Card for U.S. education. We had our lowest level achievement for 12th graders in science and math in the last 20 years. Our 8th grade students are also losing significant ground in science and math. Our children are not learning things, even to your point, Marco. They have iPhones and Wikipedia and everything else, but we're not learning anything anymore, and we're getting more and more ignorant. And then here's where I'll put in my little rant here. We're also like willfully choosing not to get vaccines in this country anymore. I was reading this shocking thing about the levels of vaccination that we're having in this country among states that are collecting data for MMR, so measles, mumps, rubella. 68% of US counties have immunization rates below 95%. 95% is the level that you need for herd immunity to take effect. 68% of US counties are okay with their kids dying from diseases that we know how to prevent. And we're okay with medical attorney generals in Florida saying, you take whatever vaccine you want. It's not the government's job to tell you what to put into your body or not. Like just like absolute like dementia about like the way to prevent things from happening. So I think you're right. I disagreed with you at first, but I also want to agree with you and say that the real problem for the United States will be we're just stupid. Like we're dumber than the Europeans. Like we don't do philosophy. We're not sitting around talking about these deeper things. We're just idiots, and we're just going to die because we're not going to take our vaccines. Anyway.
Well, I mean, look, I think that all societies have levels of ignorance probably rising, but I think social media is a problem. Also, I think that we're not keeping our kids to high standards. But look, I tend to be an optimist. I think that Charlie Kirk's ultimately death could elicit a response that jars people into this direction of realizing there's a dark path. That I haven't seen that. I really have not seen that. But what's interesting about this? What's interesting about this is that, extremism, I think, does appeal to an ever-growing part of the U.S. population on both sides. But I do think that leads, as we've said many times on this podcast, for somebody to just drive a truck through the middle. And if the next 2 years are very bad, that will set up a very interesting 27, the primary. 2027 is when the primaries are really going to start in earnest after Labor Day on 27, and we're going to all start paying attention. And I think that, from now until then, we could have a recession, we could have a stock market collapse, we could have unemployment go up, we could have a lot of bad things going on. But I think that in both parties, there will be some interesting entrepreneur who's just going to say, you know what, the common sense platform is going to win. And so that's something that I just want to leave open there. Again, I don't think we need to extrapolate all of this political violence and rhetoric into a civil war. The other thing is that, I studied civil wars quite a bit in graduate school. I was like your dad. I was going to be a prof. That was what I wanted to do. And I still love teaching, and I still love talking to, younger people and trying to help them out in their careers. And I was going to study civil wars. And one thing about civil wars that seems to really be the case almost across all examples throughout history. And again, I'm a political scientist, so I tend to generalize. Historians hate it. Historians will always say, look, every case was unique. Well, of course it is. You need to go study it and have a job. Being an expert on like Spanish Civil War. And I need to generalize and be an expert at generalizing. So anyways, that's the difference. By the way, if you ever wonder what's the difference between a political scientist and a historian, it's that. So I apologize to those who are, more historically inclined. I happen to have a BA in both, but of course, all my graduate degrees are in political science. I do think that one common thread amongst most civil wars is that the state capacity of the country in question was very weak. And so, basically, think about it in the modern context of the US, like the federal government was weak. The military was weak. The judiciary was weak. The law enforcement arm was weak. And so the country itself could not hold, like the state could not hold the country together. Let me say it again. The state could not hold the country together. That was the case in my homeland of Yugoslavia, of course, where the federal government was actually weak on purpose. It was constructed so that the states, the republics as they were called, were actually more powerful than the federal state itself. That's not really the case in the United States. And that's why I also think another fail safe against any sort of real deep political unrest in the country is that the federal government is actually quite competent and strong. Of course, too many conspiracy theories that is the problem.
Yeah, and I wonder if the advances in drone technology and things like that might actually like restore some balance of power, because the other thing is that states are so overwhelmingly strong that you can't imagine resisting them in any meaningful way. So unless the military is going to split down the middle, like it's not really going to work. But like, are what the Ukrainians are doing to Russia right now, does that point to some avenue for how to do this? I don't know.
Maybe down the line, but I don't think we're there yet. And I think that, not anytime soon.
No.
And, maybe 10, 15 years from now. But I think there's too much extrapolation towards doom and gloom. And I actually think that in 2 years' time, quite the opposite could happen. And let me just give you one example. And I know this is silly and maybe a tortured analogy for our readers. In 2006, our listeners, in 2006, if you can put yourself back in 2006, it's very difficult to do so. But, you are basically President Bush won the 2004 election handily. It's the war in Iraq is not going great. It's 2006. And the election for 2008 is the context. Who would have thought that the next president of the United States of America, elected in 2008, of all the candidates that ran for president in 2006, 2007 primary, 2008 election, would be the guy with the least amount of foreign policy experience? So in other words, what matters just 2 years ahead of a general election doesn't end up carrying the day. And I think similarly today, we're all focused on like the New York mayoral candidate, Mamdani. We're focused on like who's going to take Trump's populist legacy as Trump 3.0. And I'm sure there's somebody listening right now, whether in the White House, whether in Congress, to our podcast, and they're like, what my message to them was to be like, hey man, like if you want to win the next election, do not linearly extrapolate the current moment. I would actually non-linearly think 2 years from now what's going to matter. And it's almost never what matters right now, 2 years before.
And if you are trying to put yourself back in 2006, some of the top hits from 2006 include Daniel Powter's Bad Day, Rihanna SOS, Justin Timberlake Sexy Back, and Beyonce Irreplaceable. So if you're trying to put yourself back in that time period, that's always, I find, a way to date yourself, at least for me. And also before we...
Justin...
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Is king.
He is king. He was really good.
JT is king. I just want to say that.
Also, before we leave this, you mentioned the Spanish Civil War. So Elon, if you're listening, read Homage to Catalonia, and then come back and tell me if you should be wearing the Orwell shirt. Just putting it out there. If anybody knows Elon, like buy him a copy of Homage to Catalonia and say, just take the better part of an evening, have a glass of wine or some ketamine or whatever it is that you take and read this book, and then come back and tell Jake.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, no. The problem is that everyone read Animal Farm.
I hope so. I don't think they did, but I hope they did. I did. I'm with you.
No, everybody did. That's the one Orwell book everybody read. And it's a deeply, deeply anti-Soviet. Just to be clear, it's anti-Soviet. Yeah. Anti-authoritarian.
Anti-Stalin.
Yes, so everybody takes from anti-Stalin, exactly. And so everybody reads the Animal Farm, and they're like, well, George Orwell obviously is from the right. And then they ignore just like the rest of the canon, But yeah, I think George Orwell would have a lot of problems with a lot of things going on for sure today, on both the left and the right, to be very clear. To be very, very clear, starting with our application of the English grammar.
Yeah, that's true. I wish AI was advanced enough that we could have like a real ChatGPT that you could ask George Orwell or Christopher Hitchens, like, what would you actually say about what's going on today? Like, I think that would be a really good use of time. All right, we've been on this course for an hour. Why don't we try and make this has been geopolitical and not geopolitical, but I do have an over-under for you, Marco, and something that has very little to do with the United States. over the past 2 weeks, if you've been in Brazil, you've been watching former President Jair Bolsonaro being tried for attempting a coup. He was sentenced last week to 27 years in prison, and he could report to prison as soon as next month. It's not just him, it's a lot of his henchmen around him have also been sentenced to prison. I'll quote Brazilian historian Carlos Fico. "This is totally unprecedented. There has never been punishment for the plotters of a military coup in Brazil's history." That's because Brazil has a history of amnesty and for not punishing coup attempts. That's sort of that's how they move things on. And there are already reports that, okay, like he was sentenced to 27 years, but is he ever really going to see the inside of a jail cell? And he's still recovering from health issues from an assassination attempt against his own person, where he got, I forget if it was stabbed or shot in the gut, but he's had health problems ever since then, because whatever you think of Jair Bolsonaro, and I mean, he said lots of crazy things. This is the guy who said, unironically, that COVID vaccines would turn you into a crocodile, among other things, but has had serious health problems because somebody tried to assassinate him as well. So my over-under for you, Marco, I mean, he's not going to spend 27 years in prison. I don't know that he's going to be alive for 27 more years. But how about over under 1 year in prison for Jair Bolsonaro?
Well, 1 year. I'm taking over.
Over? Wow. Okay. Tell me why.
Well, 1 year. I mean, well, because the next, Brazil general election is in October of 2026. I believe the president doesn't actually assume power. I'm gonna say January of the following year. I think Brazil has a similar approach to the United States. So yeah, I mean, I think you set the line very short.
Okay, well, I'll reset it because I was also just looking. Lula, when he was convicted in the in that big corruption trial in 2007, car wash, he was in prison for 580 days. Of course, he was then rehabilitated and allowed to run again. But that's 580 days for Lula. That's a corruption scandal. That's not a potential military coup. So why don't we set the line at 4 years for Jair Bolsonaro in prison? Is that nicer?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. That's a really tough one, and I'll tell you why. Because then you're really having to forecast the Brazilian election. The next Brazilian election, of course, if the center-right or the right wins, they'll likely, pardon Bolsonaro in some way, shape, or form. And look, from a human perspective, I mean, the man was stabbed in his abdomen and nearly died. I mean, he had parts of his abdomen removed. I don't know, like if you stab me in the abdomen, Jacob, like there's no telling whether or not I'm going to try to do a coup d'etat here and just call it geopolitical cousin. And it's like, suddenly using AI to like replace your Muppet with like a head puppet.
That's not going to work.
I mean, look, the fact of the matter is that I think, I mean, if you set it at 4, I would take the under. Yes, I would.
And then the second part of that question is, because I already talked about Lula being rehabilitated and coming back. I think you can also compare this, and I think we do have to compare it to U.S. President Donald Trump, because there's a couple things here. First of all, Trump really likes Bolsonaro. He has put tariffs on Brazil, ostensibly because he doesn't like the fact that there's a quote-unquote witch hunt going on for Bolsonaro. And the ironic thing is, and then the other thing is, when you think about Trump's rise, Trump was dead and buried after the midterms in 2022. Everybody said he was done. But it was, in some ways, the litany of cases against him, none of which either concluded or conclusively showed that Trump had done anything truly criminal, that brought him back into the limelight, because it just kept him around the whole time. Everybody kept talking about him, and he kept on sucking up gravity, and he got this narrative about the machine is out to get me, and I'm going to sort of get back at them. And the question for for Bolsonaro is it going to be sort of similar? Is the fact that he's been convicted of this now means that, he is now bearing the cross for this, and he's going to use this on the comeback trail, and the amnesty quest is going to be part of the rehabilitation of this character? Or, and this is where it gets interesting, if you look at center-right commentary in Brazil since what the Brazilians are calling the tarifaço, the big tariffs from the United States on Brazil because of the witch hunt of Bolsonaro, even Bolsonaro's supporters are basically giving Trump the middle finger and saying, we don't want the United States telling us what to do with our politicians. Get him in jail right now. We want nothing to do with him, and let's open it up for other right-wing politicians to go in Brazil. So in some ways, it's like Trump, by intervening in one of the few major countries with which the deficit is fine, like it's a surplus, like is he sort of just shooting his knees out from under him? So I really don't know, because if Trump continues to push on Brazil, I could actually see it completely undermining Bolsonaro and maybe does spend the rest of his days in a jail. It's a really difficult one to try and add up, and the way that the U.S. is dealing with it makes it even more difficult.
Well, that's an interesting point. I think, yes, there's two things going on here. First of all, I think voters in most democracies, whether Western or Western adjacent, don't like when lawfare is used. This is the term that conservatives in the U.S. have used to describe sort of the use of legal cases against President Trump to bar him from running or to make it difficult for him. It clearly backfired in the U.S. I mean, I think we talked about this last time. 2022 midterms, there was no red wave. President Trump was blamed for Republican poor performance in November of 2022. Ron DeSantis was seen, Florida Governor DeSantis was seen as, the basically tip of the spear of the party. And I would say that between that end of 2022 and middle of 2024, all the court cases did create a sympathy wave for President Trump. Similarly with Bolsonaro, that very well could have been a dynamic. By the way, his wife is potentially one of the candidates. So there are ways for him to definitely get a pardon. You need a coalition, you need some Bolsonaro supporters. That coalition then keeps his removal from jail as condition. And I think that in that particular case, we were probably headed towards that rehabilitation because of voter backlash against using lawfare. Now, that said, President Trump then intervened and made this about us versus them. The U.S. is just not that popular in Latin America, for various reasons. So I think that could have been maybe an own goal for President Trump if he truly wants the U.S. to be aligned, his administration, with an ally in Brazil. Probably not a good idea to punish Brazilian voters with higher tariffs in the process. And same, I know you've been on this for a while, India as well. I think that U.S. use of tariffs against India, not sure if that will be successful in moving Indian policy.
Well, one thing we didn't talk about in our last episode because there were so many other things going on, but if the other things hadn't been happening, we would have talked about this South Korea story, which is not going away, with ICE arresting these hundreds of South Korean workers at a factory on the Georgia-Alabama border. A factory, by the way, I've driven by many times in my life. You're driving by that part of Georgia, Alabama, because all the signs, all the billboards go to Korean. So there's only Korean restaurants, and there's like billboards in Korean, like advertising real estate. And it's really, really strange. And it's an incredible factory. But now South Korea, like dragging Trump over the coals and demanding an apology. And the Trump administration is even backtracking on it a little bit. Do you think the Bolsonaro thing matters that much, though? I mean, I'm somebody who's been very optimistic about Brazil. Do you think ultimately it matters from a macro perspective, or do you think this is just theater?
I think that I'm not sure if it matters. I think that Bolsonaro was a force for the center right and for the right in Brazil, and but I think that there's a lot of interesting characters that could come up in Brazil as well. So I'm not sure that it matters. In fact, I think that no political party almost anywhere really matters anymore. And I think only us in the United States are blinded. I had a great conversation at lunch today, actually, with one of my friends. He runs what's called professional coaching agency. My good friend Ian Valaskakis. If anybody wants to be coached for professional reasons, seek out Ian. And, he said something interesting. This is a guy who spends a lot of time trying to think of trends that matter in the professional domain. Like, what skill sets should you, start learning? 5 years ago, Ian was telling me about AI and that I need to get serious about all these, like products that are going to come down. So, he has a pulse on this. And one of the things he said is like, look, I think the only thing that matters today is grabbing attention. Like you got to be a professional at grabbing attention. So Mamdani in New York grabbed attention. Bolsonaro grabbed attention. That's, you don't need to raise a lot of money. You don't need to go to the right newspapers. You don't have to shake hands of the right unions or kiss babies. What you need to do is grab attention. And President Trump is really good at that.
Exceptional.
He grabs attentions all the time. Mamdani is great at that. And I think that when you look at for example, when you look at the upcoming election in Brazil, which is again in 13 months, there's several candidates that are very interesting. There's a musician, there's a YouTuber, and I think that you're going to start seeing more and more celebrity-like candidates enter the fray. And no, not Mark Cuban. He missed his chance. Too old. I think that we're going to be shocked in a major democracy somewhere in the world where someone's going to come completely out of left field. And we've already obviously had that. Bukele,
Zelensky.
Salvador. I mean, we've talked. Zelensky is a great example. Yes. There's a comedian running for election in Brazil as well. A comedian, a YouTuber, and a musician. They're all kind of like thinking about it. But yeah, Zelensky is a great example. Look, Ukraine is, Eastern Europe. It's not like a developed market or whatever, but it is a country of 43 million people in Europe. And a comedian came and won. And I think that you're going to start seeing that. Macron obviously did it in France, but Macron is is seeped in French elites. And so to answer your question, doesn't matter what happens to Bolsonaro. I think on the human level, it does. I feel very sad for him. I mean, he was stabbed in his abdomen, for God's sakes. And I know, people, have a very negative opinion of him, but that really sucks. The point is, I don't think he matters, and I don't think anybody matters. And increasingly, we're going to have, I think, political entrepreneurs who are going to create an empire around them. And part of the reason, Jacob, is what we started this podcast with. There's a lot of angst. People want to break down barriers. And I think that people, in a way, what Charlie Kirk did with his career is indicative of, I think, the model of what others are going to say. Like, hey, I can just talk to people directly. I don't need to curry favor with media. I don't have to get big paychecks from donors. I can just learn to be a professional at grabbing attention. And so, no, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Well, before we leave Latin America and before we start winding down, because I'm almost out of my San Pellegrino over here, I already alluded to this a little bit, and we talked about it a little bit last time. I joked about how Donald Trump described the bags of fentanyl and cocaine just being blasted into the water. But we do have the United States carrying out a military strike against another Venezuelan vessel in international waters. And, it's the second time in the last 2 or 3 weeks that this is happening. I don't really understand what the Trump administration is doing here. Is it just that they're trying to look tough? Like, is there something towards regime change with Venezuela? Is this really about oil in China? I've seen that narrative out there. I feel like we would be derelict if we didn't at least talk about it for a second from a geopolitical perspective. Because if we're thinking about, I'm very nervous the way September is going so far. Like, we've heard a little bit from Venezuela, but we really haven't. And you know who we've heard nothing from this year so far? North Korea. And I'm just really worried that one or two or both of them are going to pop off at the same time here as we're trying to get our heads around everything else. So I don't understand the logic behind the Venezuela thing. Do you see any logic to it?
I think President Trump is a deeply political animal. I don't think he's a deeply geopolitical animal. And when I say that, I think, I think a lot of events, you and I, we've talked about this before, and I've said this to our listeners. I hope that one of the things we can do is just give you a sense that things are complicated and confusing, and if you don't understand them, that's okay. In geopolitics, there's rarely a simple explanation. And don't listen to those people that try to weave threads of narrative of sanity between events that occur in different disparate parts of the world. There often aren't. Why did Benjamin Netanyahu bomb Qatar? Because he needs to look tough at home. Like, I don't think it was about killing the Hamas negotiators in Qatar. Like, how does that do anything? Even if you don't want to negotiate, just don't negotiate with them. Kill them when they leave Qatar. Like, I mean, it wasn't critical for Israel to do that. So no, I don't think there's a deeper geopolitical point there. Similarly with President Trump, I think that President Trump wants to show that he's serious about interdicting drugs. I think that he genuinely does not like the Venezuelan regime, and who does? And I think and that's what this is. It's a show of force. It's a show of force in the Western Hemisphere. But I would also disagree with your use of the term vessel. It has connotations of a large craft with displacement levels that require a certain harbor. Like, come on. These are just tiny rinky-dink vessels running around like boats, And the U.S. has sent like a nuclear-powered submarine to the Caribbean to interdict these vessels. It's an overwhelming show of force. Could it be beginning of a regime change? Or our listeners who know that we scoffed at the notion that there could be regime change in Iran with fighter jets. Similarly, I don't think there can be regime change in Venezuela. It's a country of 28 million people with a very large armed forces. So, no, I don't think there's a deeper plan here. I really don't, Jacob. And I think that sometimes us commentators in geopolitics, we see a nail and we hammer it, right? Like, we see an event between states and we're like, there's a geopolitical logic. Or maybe President Trump just wants to look tough on drugs.
Yeah, it's probably as simple as that. Miraculously, Marco, I've gotten through most of my tabs. My last tab, and it won't take more than a minute to say, is I don't know if you saw this, but last week, China declared that they are going to create a national nature reserve at Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. And I thought that was beautiful. Like, what are you going to do now, Philippines? You're gonna object to us having a national nature reserve there? They're also now starting to intercept Philippine ships and do all these other things. But I will say, while everybody else is freaking out about Taiwan, I spend an inordinate amount of time looking at the Philippines and China and all these stupid little atolls and islands that don't mean anything, but that, Well, go ahead.
Yeah, and by the way, I think it's very important. We haven't really talked about drones in Poland and Romania.
No, we haven't. You want to? We can close out on that if you want.
Well, let's talk about that in the Philippines. I think why do countries unnecessarily heighten tensions when they have no intention to follow up on them? And I'm not saying that China will not follow up on the Philippines. That may yet occur. But Russia is not going to invade Poland or Romania because it's struggled to conquer territory in a country next door. As our listeners know, I have incredible disdain for the Russian military in 2025, not their predecessors who saved our liberty from the Nazis. So what am I getting at here? Why would Putin send some drones to Poland and Romania? And why would China increase tensions with the Philippines? Because you want to test. It's like a jab in boxing. You're just testing the resolve. And one of the things that President Trump has thrown into kind of disarray or thrown into question, let's just say, is like, well, what is the level of American commitment with all of these allies of theirs? And so I think that, our listeners who are concerned about World War III or Russia looking to invade Poland, no, this is not the beginning of an invasion of Poland whatsoever. They want to know what the reaction is. And similarly with China and the Philippines, South China Sea has been a hotbed of geopolitical activity for the last 15 years. We've both been following this very carefully. You have a new president in the United States of America. You want to see how he reacts. Does he and his administration send a strong signal that, no, we still have treaty obligations with the Philippines. We're going to be there for them. And obviously similarly with Poland and Romania. And so it's like a heat check in basketball. You want to do one every quarter. It doesn't mean that that something is going to happen. You're just kind of like, hey, let me just see what is the reaction here. What are they going to do? It's like my go-to move in basketball is a right-handed baby hook. Occasionally, I will throw up an extremely ugly left-handed hook, Jacob. It is atrociously ugly. But the reason you do it is because you want the guy guarding you to think you can go left. By the way, I can't. And if you're one of my buddies I play basketball with on Saturdays in Brentwood and you're not listening to this podcast, now you don't know and you should have been listening. But I think that's what's happening here on both South China Sea and Poland and Romania. It's just testing. US does the same thing to its rivals as well. We just don't report on it because it's the US doing it.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, do you think that Putin is satisfied with his test of Poland and Romania? Do you think he got the result that he wanted?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I would have wanted to see a much more forceful response if I was both, quite frankly. But that's just me. The other thing that I think Putin may be collecting political capital domestically to wrap up the war. And so over the next couple of months, I do think that he may have to illustrate to his own domestic audience that he is willing to do very, very dangerous things. Because what he may have to do at the end of the next 2 to 3 months is come home empty-handed as far as the totality of Donbass is concerned. And we've talked about this on this podcast quite a bit. They haven't conquered all of the territory that makes up Donbass. There's a sliver of territory in Donetsk. And I think that in order to end the war, he may have to escalate it first. This happens quite often in conflicts, But, I said that about Netanyahu like 12 months ago as well, that, the Israeli government may have to escalate the conflict in order to then come back domestically and say, look, we were really tough. Like, we were serious about this. But here we are in 2025, 3 years almost after that terrorist attack on October 7th, and the war is still going on quite viciously. So I'm not sure to what extent that thesis holds any water.
Yeah, and there's also a difference between China probing with the Philippines because the Philippines can't do anything to China, whereas like I was talking to a Polish friend who was in the government at one point about what Russia was doing, and he's very critical of the current Polish government. He thinks that Poland has made itself a vassal state to the United States, and he wants a much more independent Polish foreign policy. And his response was, we should go take Kaliningrad right now. Like, enough of this messing around with the Russians. Like, let's actually do this shit. And like, Poland could do that. Like, that's not out of the realm of possibility, where it's not like the Philippines is going to be like, you're going to steal Scarborough Shoal and make it a nature reserve? Well, we're taking Hong Kong. Like, we're taking this thing. Like, that's not going to happen with the Philippines. Whereas if you're going to fuck with Poland, like, there was a time in European history where like Poland was the country. Like, do you really want to deal with that, Vladimir? I don't quite get it. So.
Look, a simple analysis of order of battle can tell you that Poland has a very serious military. So I completely agree with you. And the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth did spread from the Baltic to the Black Sea. But I will also note that the reason the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was the largest country in like Europe's history is also because it filled a vacuum deserted by the Mongolian invasions. Like, it was ruling over extremely sparsely populated parts of Europe. Nonetheless, not taking anything away from Poles, it was. I absolutely agree with you. Absolutely agree. And that's why I was a little surprised by the Polish reaction.
Yeah.
I don't think invading Kaliningrad yet makes any sense. But certainly, one of the things that Poland and Romania could claim is that they now have a legitimate reason to invade Ukrainian airspace. First and foremost, Kiev would allow them to do so. And Poland and Romania could say, look, these drones are making incursions from within Ukraine, even though they probably are not. But let's say they are. In Romania's case, they almost certainly
Yeah, they
are.
are.
And so, Romania and Poland could say like, well, look, we're going to create a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. And if any Sukhoi wants to come and sniff around, well, you're going to have to deal with highly sophisticated fifth generation fighter jets that we own. So that's something to kind of think about here. And I would have probed that as an idea if I was Polish or Romanian, just because I think that I was extremely concerned about no-fly zone talk
Mhm.
early in the war. But I think that Russia is begging us to end this war for them. I honestly do. I don't think that they're looking this media narrative that Russia's winning. I don't know what it's based on. Like their expansion of territorial control over Ukrainian territory is glacier paced. It's still very slow. Will they conquer? I saw someone say, well, in 17 years, they'll be at the Dnieper. I'm like, in 17 years, there'll be like 70 million Russians left. Like after North Korea, who's going to fight here? So the point here is that I think that Russia, like I don't know how long they can withstand this, but NATO and the West can start ratcheting up tensions in kind of a death by a thousand cuts approach. And that's something to keep in mind. And for Poland and Romania to say, hey, listen, we're going to have to start patrolling Western Ukrainian skies because these drones are just coming in from Ukraine. What is Russia going to do about that? Are they going to dogfight with Polish and Romanian highly sophisticated fighter jets? I think that would be a mistake for them because they'd be embarrassed.
All right. That's 90 minutes. Marco, anything else you want to tell the listeners?
EuroBasket.
Oh, yeah, please. The update.
The update is that Germany has a golden generation. I want to salute Dennis Schroeder, FIBA demigod.
Former Atlanta
FIBA
Hawk.
FIBA Dennis.
Former Atlanta Hawk.
Former Atlanta Hawk, former Laker as well. Dennis Schroeder is an exceptional competitor. He now has the MVP for the last World Cup, where Germany won gold. He also now has the MVP of the probably most competitive EuroBasket in history. The team I was cheering for, my fatherland, Serbia, disappointing result. So that's too bad. Fat Jokic did not last. In fact, skinny Luka lasted longer than Fat Jokic. Maybe bad news for Denver. But I just want to say that what the German team did was amazing. And one of the best things about this German team is that European teams in basketball have this tendency to import foreigners, namely Americans, namely point guards, for the purposes of national team. Like Turkey had Shane Larkin. Now, granted, Shane Larkin has played in Turkish leagues for a long time, so God bless him on that. But this is a German team. These guys are German. They're born in Germany. And they represent the best the country has in basketball, since Nowitzki and Detlef Schrempf and so on. Nowitzki, by the way, never won the EuroBasket. Schrempf did in 1993. For those of your listeners trying to connect this with geopolitics and world affairs, I think it's very interesting how countries celebrate success. And what's interesting is that the German football has probably never been at its weakest than today. And yet when their basketball team won the World Cup in basketball in 23, nobody waited for them at the airport.
Yeah.
There's very little celebration. And I hope that changes because, Germany's going to have to face a new world. And in a new world, Russians are back at the gates. Germany has to remilitarize. And maybe you're now a basketball power and not a football power. So there you go. There's no linearity in geopolitics and history.
I totally missed that Shane Larkin was playing for the Turkish team. I also
He's been playing.
I totally missed that he's the son of Barry Larkin too. Like, wow, now we're really getting deep here.
He is.
Wow.
No, but one thing I do want to say that Shane Larkin actually has a legitimate claim to play for Turkey. He's been playing for, I think, Efes since 2018. So this isn't like Montenegro or some random country in Europe being like, hey, you want to come play for our team? Like, I've never even played in your league. Shane Larkin's played in Turkey for like, what is that, 7 years now? So anyways, like that's a special case though. All right, that's it. That's all for me.
That's a wrap. All right, good shit, man.